Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes alive. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. The day the Millers moved in next door, I knew something was off. It wasn't just the fact that they arrived at night, their moving truck pulling up well after sunset. It wasn't even the strange, elongated boxes they carried inside, looking suspiciously like coffins. No. It was the way Mr. Miller looked at me when I went outside to welcome them to the neighborhood. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the dim porch lights like a cat's. When he smiled and shook my hand, his grip was ice cold, and I could have sworn I saw the glint of unusually sharp canines. But what truly unnerved me was the smell, a sickly sweet odor of decay that clung to him like cheap cologne, making my stomach turn. "We're so pleased to meet you," Mrs. Miller said, her voice like honey, smooth and sweet. "We do hope we can be close neighbors." As she spoke, her tongue flicked across her lips in a way that reminded me of a snake tasting the air. I suppressed a shudder and retreated to my house, shutting the door firmly behind me. That night I lay awake, listening to the strange shuffling sounds coming from next door, punctuated by what sounded like muffled screams. At one point, I heard what could only be described as the wet sound of meat being torn from bone, followed by satisfied sighs that were almost orgasmic. Over the next few weeks, I observed the Millers closely. They rarely seemed to leave their house during the day, and their curtains remained tightly drawn at all times. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of them at night, moving gracefully through their backyard or standing motionless on their porch, staring up at the moon. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw Mr. Miller in his driveway. He was bent over something, and I heard a wet, slurping sound. When he straightened up and turned towards me, I gasped. His mouth was smeared with what looked like blood, and his eyes glowed an eerie red in the darkness. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and smiled at me. "Good evening, neighbor," he called out cheerfully, as if nothing was amiss. I mumbled a reply and hurried back inside, my heart pounding. That night, I began my research. I scoured the internet for information on vampires, cross-referencing folklore with odd behaviors I'd witnessed. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the Millers were not human. I started taking precaution. I hung garlic in my windows and ordered silver crosses online. I even considered planting rows of garlic in my garden, but I didn't want to tip them off that I was onto them. As the days passed, I noticed more and more strange occurrences. Neighborhood pets began to disappear. The Millers' trash cans were always empty on collection day. And most disturbing of all, I never saw them eat or drink anything. A week before Mrs. Miller's midnight burial activity, I had a disturbing encounter with our mail carrier, Jenny. She had been delivering to our street for years. I remembered her cheerful waves from when I first moved in. But that morning, something was different. Her hands trembled as she handed me a certified letter. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and she kept glancing over her shoulder at the Miller's house. "Everything okay?" I asked, signing for the letter. Yes, I don't know." She lowered her voice. "That new couple, the Millers, do they ever seem strange to you?" My pulse quickened. "Strange how?" Last week, Mr. Miller invited me in for water during the hot spell, said I looked dehydrated. She rubbed her neck absently. Things got fuzzy after that. I woke up hours later in my truck, parked 3 blocks away, and ever since. She pulled her collar aside slightly, revealing what looked like 2 small puncture marks. You should report it, I said, but she was already backing away. No, forget I said anything. Just be careful. That was the last time I saw Jenny. The next day, a different carrier worked our route. When I called the post office, they said Jenny had quit unexpectedly, leaving a note about moving out of state. But her car was still parked at her apartment complex, gathering dust. I should have done something then, should have believed her, should have helped her. But what could I have said? That I suspected our neighbors were vampires? Now, Jenny was gone, and her disappearance weighed on my conscience like a stone. One night, unable to sleep, I peered out my bedroom window and saw Mrs. Miller in their backyard. She was digging what looked like a shallow grave. As I watched, horrified, she dragged a large, person-shaped bundle wrapped in a sheet and dumped it into the hole. Before moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood, I spent 15 years as a crime beat reporter for the city newspaper. Years of investigating suspicious deaths, interviewing witnesses, and uncovering hidden truths had honed my instincts for when something wasn't quite right. My colleagues used to joke that I had a sixth sense for detecting lies, a skill that had helped break numerous cases wide open. But that career came to an abrupt halt 3 years ago, when my investigation into a series of mysterious disappearances led me too close to some powerful people. My editor killed the story, citing lack of concrete evidence, but I knew the truth. Someone had gotten to him. When I tried to pursue it independently, I started receiving threats. First, phone calls, then dead animals on my doorstep. The final straw was when my apartment was broken into and all my research files were stolen. That's when I decided to retreat to the suburbs, trading my cramped city apartment for a modest house in a seemingly peaceful neighborhood. I took a job editing technical manuals from home. Boring work, but it paid the bills and kept me safely anonymous. Or so I thought. The first year was quiet, almost mundanely so. I struggled to adjust to the slower pace of life, to neighbors who wanted to chat about garden fertilizer instead of corruption and cover-ups. I started seeing a therapist who helped me work through my paranoia and hypervigilance. I was just beginning to believe I could have a normal life again. Then the Millers moved in next door. I knew I had to do something, but who would believe me? I couldn't go to the police. They'd think I was crazy. I considered moving, but the thought of leaving innocent people at the mercy of these monsters was too much to bear. So, I decided to gather evidence. I set up cameras around my property, hoping to catch the Millers in the act. For weeks, I reviewed hours of footage, but they were clever. They always seemed to know where the cameras were and avoided them. Then, one night, I got lucky. My backyard camera caught Mr. Miller scaling the fence between our properties with inhuman speed and agility. He moved towards my house, his eyes glowing in the infrared light. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as he tried the back door, then started to climb up towards my bedroom window. Panicking, I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a wooden broom handle, and I stood ready by the window. As Mr. Miller's pale face appeared, I struck out wildly, catching him off guard. He hissed in pain and fell backwards, disappearing into the darkness below. The next day, there was no sign of Mr. Miller. Mrs. Miller came over, all smiles and concern, asking if I'd seen her husband. I lied, saying I hadn't, but my hands were shaking as I gripped the doorframe. "Oh dear," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I do hope nothing's happened to him. It's not like him to disappear without a word." As she turned to leave, she paused and sniffed the air. "My, what a lovely scent," she murmured. "Is that garlic I smell?" I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. They knew. They had to know I was onto them. Maybe if I hadn't spent years developing an eye for detail, I wouldn't have noticed the little things that seemed off about them. Maybe if I hadn't learned to trust my instincts about when someone was hiding something, I would have dismissed my suspicions as imagination. And maybe if I hadn't already seen how dark the world could be, I would have been able to convince myself that vampires couldn't possibly be real. But I had, and I did, and I couldn't. Because some habits die hard. I kept detailed notes about their suspicious behavior, just like I used to do for my stories. I set up surveillance equipment I still had from my reporting days. And when things started getting strange, I did what any good investigative journalist would do. I started digging deeper. The irony wasn't lost on me that after fleeing from one dangerous story, I'd stumbled right into another. Only this time, I wasn't dealing with corrupt politicians or criminal conspiracies. I was dealing with something far more ancient and deadly. And unlike my previous investigations, I couldn't simply publish what I'd discovered and let the authorities handle it. This time, I was on my own. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house had me sitting bolt upright, clutching my makeshift stake. As dawn approached, I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I was awakened by a knock at the door. Groggy and disoriented, I made my way downstairs. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Miller standing on the porch, smiling pleasantly. The sun was shining brightly behind her. Confused, I opened the door a crack. "Yes?" I asked warily. "Good morning, neighbor," she chirped. "I just wanted to let you know that my husband's come home. He had a bit too much to drink last night and ended up at a friend's house. Can you believe it?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. She was standing in broad daylight, looking perfectly normal. No smoke, no burning, nothing like the vampires I'd read about. "Oh," I managed to say, "that's good." "Indeed it is," she replied, her smile never wavering. "By the way, we're having a little barbecue this evening. We'd love for you to join us. Say, around sunset?" Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, humming to herself. I closed the door and leaned against it, my mind racing. Had I imagined everything? Was I losing my mind? Shaken by Mrs. Miller's daytime visit, I dove back into my research with renewed urgency. Most vampire lore insisted they couldn't survive in sunlight, but clearly the Millers could. Either I was wrong about everything, or there was something I was missing. After hours of searching through obscure folklore sites and ancient mythology forums, I found an archived article about a rare subset of vampires known as daywalkers. Vampires who had developed a partial immunity to sunlight through centuries of careful exposure and magical adaptation. These daywalkers could withstand the sunlight for short periods of time. The article mentioned that they were especially dangerous because they could blend seamlessly into human society, hosting parties and maintaining normal social lives while hunting their prey. The more I read, the more it fit. Their ability to move freely during the day explained why no one else suspected them. It explained their perfect lawn, their social connections, their carefully maintained facade of normalcy. The Millers weren't just vampires. They were evolved predators who had adapted to hide in plain sight. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. If they could walk in daylight, there would be no respite from their surveillance, no time of day when I could truly feel safe. And worse, if they were this evolved, how many others like them were out there, hiding in our quiet suburbs, hosting other innocent barbecues? My screen glowed with one final detail that made my blood run cold. Daywalkers were known for their elaborate hunting rituals, often gathering large groups of victims for what the text called feast parties, social events where they could feed on multiple victims at once. The barbecue invitation suddenly took on a much darker meaning. As evening approached, I debated whether or not to go to the Millers' barbecue. On one hand, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to observe them up close and potentially gather more evidence. On the other hand, it could be a trap. In the end, curiosity won out. I tucked a small silver cross in my pocket and made my way next door. The Miller's backyard was transformed. Tiki torches lined the fence, casting a warm glow over the gathering. A few other neighbors were already there, chatting and laughing. Mr. Miller stood at the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs. "There you are," Mrs. Miller exclaimed, gliding over to me. "We're glad you could make it. Can I offer you a drink? We have a lovely red wine." I accepted the glass she handed me, but didn't drink. Instead, I watched as the Millers moved among their guests, the picture of perfect hosts. They seemed to eat and drink normally, even though this is the first time I've seen them eat anything. They laughed at jokes and made small talk. As the night wore on, I began to relax. Maybe I had been wrong about them. Maybe the stress of living alone had gotten to me, making me see things that weren't there. The Thompsons from across the street arrived late, looking oddly dazed. Julie Thompson, usually a chatterbox, spoke in monotone sentences, her usual animation completely gone. Her husband Bob's neck sported a small bandage. "Just a shaving cut," Mrs. Miller explained smoothly when she noticed me staring. I watched Mr. Miller work the crowd with practiced ease. He had a way of touching people's shoulders as he spoke, and each time he did, their posture would slacken slightly, their eyes growing unfocused. He steered conversations masterfully, deflecting questions about their past or daily routines with well-timed distractions. "Oh, you must try these stuffed mushrooms," he'd say, pressing appetizers on guests just as they began asking about his profession. Mrs. Miller was equally skilled. She flitted between groups, topping off wine glasses with a vintage she claimed was from their private collection. The wine had an odd metallic smell that made me think of copper and rust. When she offered me a mushroom, I pretended to eat it, secretly slipping it into my napkin. Later, I noticed others who'd eaten them becoming increasingly compliant, almost sleepwalking through their conversations. The new neighbors from 2 doors down, the Patels, sat in the corner looking as unsettled as I felt. Mrs. Patel kept declining food, claiming dietary restrictions. I noticed she also wore a small religious pendant that made Mrs. Miller keep her distance. Every time the Patels tried to leave, the Millers would smoothly intercept them with fresh drinks and elaborate explanations of why they should stay just a bit longer. The longer I watched, the more I saw the barbecue for what it really was. Not a neighborly gathering, but a carefully orchestrated performance. The Millers moved through their roles with the precision of predators who'd done this countless times before, slowly wearing down their prey's defenses with food, wine, and calculated charm. I wasn't the only one noticing something was wrong. I overheard Linda Baker whispering to her husband about feeling dizzy, about how she couldn't seem to remember arriving at the party. But before she could finish her thought, Mrs. Miller appeared with another glass of wine, and Linda's concerns melted away with each sip. Just as I was about to take a sip of my wine, I noticed something odd. The Millers' plates, while they had moved around the buffet table several times, were still full, and their wine glasses, despite frequent toasts, never seemed to empty. I set my glass down and made my way to the bathroom, needing a moment to clear my head. As I passed by the Miller's bedroom, I heard hushed voices. I paused, listening. "They suspect nothing," Mr. Miller was saying. "The fool next door may have had his suspicions, but I think we've put those to rest." "Indeed," Mrs. Miller replied. "It was clever of you to suggest this little gathering. Now no one will question our dietary habits." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I bumped into a small table, knocking over a framed photograph. As I bent to pick it up, I froze. The photo showed the Millers standing in front of what looked like the Eiffel Tower, but the clothes they wore were distinctly from another era, the early 1900s, if I had to guess. And yet, they looked exactly the same as they did now. I heard footsteps approaching and quickly set the photo back on the table. Mrs. Miller appeared in the hallway, her smile as pleasant as ever. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Yes," I stammered. "I was just looking for the bathroom." "Oh, it's right down there," she said, pointing. "Do hurry back. We're about to serve dessert. It's a very special recipe." I nodded and practically ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My mind was reeling. The photo, the conversation I'd overheard, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. I hadn't been imagining things. The Millers really were vampires. I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave. I had to warn the others. But how? Who would believe me? Taking a deep breath, I splashed some water on my face and stepped out of the bathroom. As I made my way back to the party, I arrived just as it took a horrifying turn when Mr. Miller stood to make a toast. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made my bones ache. "You've all been so welcoming to us. Allow us to show our appreciation." The words seemed to trigger something in the air itself. The tiki torches flicked and dimmed, casting writhing shadows on the fence. Around me, guests began to sway, their eyes glazing over as if hypnotized. The wine glasses in their hands dropped to the ground one by one, shattering in a crimson constellation across the patio. I watched in horror as the Millers' faces began to change. Their skin grew translucent, blue veins pulsing beneath like dark rivers. Their eyes blazed red, and their jaws elongated to accommodate rows of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to go on forever. Mrs. Miller's perfectly manicured nails extended into yellowed talons that clicked against her wine glass with a sound like bones falling into a grave. "The thing about suburban life," Mr. Miller said, his voice now a guttural rasp, "is that no one really notices when people go missing. They just assume their neighbors moved away." He gestured at the dozens of empty houses on our street, houses I had assumed were vacant due to the housing market. So many delicious neighbors over the years. And now, you'll all join our little community. Mrs. Miller laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Think of it as an eternal block party." As my neighbors began to collapse around me, I made a desperate break for the gate. But something caught my ankle, a hand bursting from the ground, its flesh gray and mottled. With growing terror, I realized the Millers' immaculate lawn wasn't just well-maintained. It was fertilized with the remains of previous dinner parties. More hands erupted from the earth, dozens of them, belonging to past victims who weren't quite dead, just trapped in a horrifying limbo between life and undeath. They groped blindly at the air, searching for fresh prey. Mr. Miller's voice came from behind me, closer than it should have been possible. "You know too much, dear neighbor, but don't worry. We have special plans for you. After all, what better way to hide our nature than to have a former investigative reporter insisting that we're vampires? Who would believe the ravings of a paranoid shut-in?" As they closed in on me, their shadows stretching impossibly long in the dying light, I realized with mounting dread that this wasn't just about feeding. This was about establishing dominance over their hunting ground. The suburbs weren't just their home. They were their larder, their empire of carefully cultivated prey. The last thing I saw before consciousness faded was Mrs. Miller's face hovering over mine, her fangs dripping with what looked suspiciously like my neighbor's wine. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear," she whispered. "We're going to be such good friends. Forever." In my final moments of clarity, I understood why they had chosen this place, this life. In the city, disappearances were investigated, questions were asked. But here, in this quiet suburb where everyone kept to themselves, where people moved in and out without anyone really noticing, here they could feast indefinitely. The darkness took me then, and with it came the horrible knowledge that I would wake up changed, if I woke up at all. The Millers had found their perfect hunting ground, and I had just become their newest acquisition. After all, what's one more missing person in a neighborhood where people come and go like shadows in the night? And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.